Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. I'm Rebecca Rose, the Combat Antisemitism Movement's Director of North American Affairs. Today's discussion is titled Unraveling the Origins and Examination of Anti-Semitism Within Palestinian Society. Our goal today is to learn more about the history of anti-Semitic ideologies embedded in the Palestinian nationalist movement, manifested most clearly today in media programming and school textbooks. We are honored to have four distinguished guests with us today for this very important discussion as we analyze the concerning phenomenon and how its impacts on the prospects for the Israeli-Palestinian peace and coexistence, as well as we will explore potential remedies to counter it. I want to give a warm welcome to our guests. Itamar Marcus, he's the founder and director of Palestinian Media Watch, one of the world's foremost experts on the Palestinian Authority. Itamar travels the globe speaking to lawmakers and government officials presenting Palestinian Media Watch's findings that have literally changed the way the world regards the Palestinian Authority. Welcome, Itamar.
Thank you.
Marcus Sheff is CEO at the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Textbooks, Impact C, which he has led since 2016. The organization has driven the elimination of anti-Semitism and the inclusion of Jewish history in textbooks in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE, and is today working in several more MENA countries. It has ensured that the Palestinian Authority's UNRWA textbooks are a hot-button issue around the world. Impact C analyzes textbooks employing standards on peace and tolerance as derived from international declarations and resolutions. Welcome, Marcus. And Asaf Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. Asaf is also a Senior Non-Resident Research Fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a Professor Affiliate at the University of Haifa. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King College London, and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israeli and Zionist history. Welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for joining CAM today.
Thank you.
We're going to start with Marcus. Marcus, your research has shown that Palestinian textbooks today are doing extreme damage to the next generation of Palestinian youth. Recent Impact C research has revealed that Palestinian curriculum demonizes Israel even more now than in the past, and anti-Semitic content is even more prevalent. Israel, even within the pre-67 lines, is generally described as the Zionist occupation, and school materials systematically detail supposed evil deeds perpetrated by Israel. Furthermore, examples of cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis are not taught, and there is no education promoting coexistence. Please talk to us more about this incredible issue. What is being done to address and expose this hateful indoctrination?
With pleasure, Rebecca. Thank you, and thank you for the wonderful work that CAM does. So just to go one step backwards, Impact SE, Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, analyzes textbooks and presents policy recommendations to decision makers to encourage standards of peace and tolerance in education. And the question is always, why textbooks? And I think the answer is something we know. They are the key to fostering the development of peaceful, tolerant societies of the future that we all want to see, right? They are central to conveying the political, the social values, and the national identity that leaders want to impart to the next generation. And of course, they're also where negative influences take root. And leaders for generations have known that textbooks can cement anti-Semitic attitudes in hundreds of millions of future citizens, like frankly no other medium. And why? Because textbooks are uniquely authoritative beyond any other medium. Here in the Middle East, where I am now, you tend to get one book, one subject, and one grade. And so we, Impact SE, deliver world-class research and recommendations to policymakers. We work with governments in the Middle East to drive change with the textbooks in that country. Our work is regularly quoted by the US State Department, the US government, other departments, and of course the anti-Semitism envoy. So that is the basis to the Palestinian curriculum and why what is being taught is so important. I mean, first of all, let's be clear about one thing. The Palestinian Authority has decided a strategic decision to radicalize 1.3 million children every school day through its textbooks. And UNRWA schools that are supported by the USA use exactly the same textbooks as the Palestinian Authority. And Impact SE is the pioneer in reviewing the Palestinian curriculum. We first reviewed it in 2000, and this current Palestinian curriculum, which came online in 2016, is more radical than anything we have seen. Peace is not presented as preferred or not even possible. Peace agreements and proposals with Israel, which previously appeared, have been totally removed. And what remains is a very clear vision. Palestinian state from the river to the sea, which is gained through jihad, through martyrdom, and through violence. And these textbooks are riddled with Jew hate. They teach that Jews are liars and fraudsters. One textbook warns of the danger of the Jews. Jews are described as treacherous, dangerous, hostile, and violent towards the prophets sent by God. There are grading instructions for examiners to punish students for not connecting Judaism with murder. Judaism with murder. And of course, Jews control the media, politics, and the economy in this curriculum. A teacher's guide defines anti-Semitism as the struggle between Jews and other nations. That is their idea of what anti-Semitism is. And it is considered to be an invention. It is created in Palestinian textbooks, they say, to garner world sympathy. So what have we done about this? Policymakers around the world take our reports to meetings with the Palestinians and ask them the tough questions. That is obviously really important. And that is why the PA, UNRWA, and Arabic media attack Impact SE unremittingly and week after week. We educate regularly at Congress around the bills associated with PA textbooks, particularly with Democratic Congress members. We have spoken in committee at the European Parliament multiple times and have supported members of that parliament on legislation. And you should know, the European Parliament has on 5 separate occasions, and recently, by the way, as last week, passed bipartisan legislation overwhelmingly condemning the anti-Semitism in the PA and under schools it finances based on our work. Just to quote our friend, EU Parliament Vice President Nicola Beer of the left-wing Renew Europe Party, what she said recently in Parliament, and I quote, depicting Jews as dangerous, demonizing them, perpetuating anti-Jewish prejudices in textbooks is very upsetting. Reading about school books, and here I speak as a mother, glorifying terrorist Dalal al-Mughrabi, presenting cold-blooded violence against civilians, including children as resistance, leaves me speechless. And even the United Nations condemned the anti-Semitism in PA textbooks following a session that Impact SE addressed on the issue. So we have ensured that PA textbooks are a hot-button issue in the US Congress, in the European Parliament, in the UK, in Norway, Switzerland, and around Europe. And this has made a real significant difference to funding. Over the last years, Impact SE has become synonymous with this effort among senior policymakers. But I will just finish this element in saying the PA and UNRWA have no intention of changing these anti-Semitic textbooks. We need to know that. Let's not fool ourselves about this. We, Impact SE, have no intention of letting the matter drop, but there is no horizon for change. There is an enormous amount of change which is happening around the MENA region. I'd be very happy to speak about that later, Rebecca.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marcus. Itamar, let's change gears a little bit. As Palestinian Media Watch has detailed in depth, it's been more than 3 decades since the signing of the Oslo Accords, and the Palestinian Authority is still actively poisoning the minds of its children with hate. Please illuminate for us the origins of this hate, starting in 1964 with the founding of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or even earlier if you wish. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I'm going to do a share screen here. Okay. So I decided to actually go with your topic, unraveling the origin of Palestinian Authority anti-Semitism. And this is very, very important because Since we started following the Palestinian Authority in 1996, and in studying everything about them, we studied everything we could get from the media looking at society, children's programming. In 1998, we actually did the first report on Palestinian school books. We did Palestinian school books for the next few years, reports. And what we saw was consistent messages. Now, what I want to show you is that, and this is critical, the Palestinian anti-Semitism, here. Palestinian anti-Semitism is not isolated hate speech. It's not a lot of separate different issues or separate different slurs that they say about Jews. It is actually fundamental to their PA ideology. It's necessary for the rewriting of history, and it's necessary for the denying Israel's right to exist. And that's why it's going to be so hard. And that's why it's impossible, really, for them to change it. And I want to show you what I mean by this. Why is this so fundamental? Now, going back to the very beginning, 1998, a number of years after the establishment of the PA, and there was an event where all the Palestinian historians got together, and in part of the summary of the event, they called on all universities and college to write the history of Palestine, and not to the foreign implants and enemies to distort it or legitimize the existence of Jews on this land. History had to be rewritten. The Jewish people had a history thousands of years. There was no Palestinian history. The Palestinian Authority decides that it gives this message to the historians. We have to create a new history. We have to ignore the Jewish past, and we have to create a Palestinian history. And here in the continuation, it says there is no connection between the ancient generation of Jews and the new generation. Okay. Israel today has no connection. So this is the first principle. And what they do is they then create this fictitious history. The Jews never were in the land. Palestinians have thousands of years of history. This is the history that they create. And I'll show you here an example. This is the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. You can't go much higher than that except for Abbas, talking last year on Palestinian TV.
ومشروعنا لتحرير الأرض والإنسان ونحن متجذرون هنا هزمنا الهكسوس والرومان واليونان والفرس.
Okay, here you see it goes on and on. They've defeated all these people. We've had this, not just the history, we've had a glorious history. We defeated the Romans, be proud of your Palestinian history. On the other hand, and I'll just give you one example of a constant message. Here's Abbas's advisor. He talks about Jewish history as fables, lies, fake inventions that they falsely claim the presence of a so-called ancient kingdom of Israel. There was no truth to this. There is no Jewish history. We have a thousands of year history. So this is the message. Now, this leaves the Palestinian Authority with an incredible challenge. Why would the Jews come to the land of Palestine and try to steal it from them if we have no history here? So they had to come up with a legitimate excuse. And this is where Palestinian anti-Semitism starts. The Palestinian Authority has told its people, and it teaches them, and we see it everywhere, from its children's programming to messages by the leadership, from the school book since the beginning. The Jews were so evil that they're hated by everyone, and therefore the international community, as an act of self-defense to get rid of the Jews, stole Palestine and sent the Jews there. I want to give you one example from just a few months ago on official PA TV.
اليهود في طبعهم أنهم متعالين لا يقبلون بالآخر دائما منطوئين على أنفسهم. الأوروبيون كرهوهم وأرادوا التخلص منهم، فكانت إحدى مصالح الدول الأوروبية التخلص من اليهود، فبدأت فكرة قامت دولة لليهود وفكرهم قائم على عنصرية جعلتهم مكروهين في أي مكان. فكر الصهيوني قائم على انهم شعب الله المختار في بروتوكولات حكماء.
And he goes on and on. This was a long interview where he described how Jews are so evil, everyone hated them, and as he said, that created the idea for a Jewish state. The Jews would never have thought to come here because we had no history. That's the fundamental PA message. Here is another fascinating example from the Fatah. The difference between Hitler and Balfour was that Balfour had colonies, among them Palestine, so he sent the Jews there. Hitler didn't have colonies, and therefore he got rid of them through extermination. In other words, the Balfour and Hitler had the same motivation. They wanted to be free of Jews. Balfour didn't have to exterminate the Jews because he could steal Palestine, whereas the Nazis didn't have a colony to send them, so they had to kill them. It's an incredible message. We've been hearing this since the beginning of the PA. Abbas himself has talked about this as recently as his speech in the UN. First, I'll give you the background. Here's Abbas speaking a number of years ago, and he talks about all the massacres that the Jews suffered throughout history. Every 10 to 15 years, they had massacres right up and including the Holocaust. And he says, why did this happen? It was due to their social role, usury, banks, so forth. Jews brought the Holocaust on themselves because of their social role. This is the message coming from the top of the PA. And just at the UN a couple of months ago, this is what Abbas said.
إن بريطانيا والولايات المتحدة قررتا إقامة وزرع كيان آخر في وطننا التاريخي، وذلك لأهداف استعمارية. والحقيقة أن هذه الدول الغربية كانت تريد أن تتخلص من اليهود وأن تستفيد منهم في
Okay, they wanted to get rid of the Jews. This is part of that message. The Jews are so evil, so dangerous, so threatening, so racist. They had to get rid of them, and they decided on Palestine. That way they could have a colony. Two birds with one stone. This is probably the most fundamental message of Palestinian identity, because it says we have the rights to all the land. The Jews are a colonial implant with no right to exist, and they're only here because they were so evil. There's also another message here, which is terrible. Don't worry about hating the Jews. It's not just we Palestinians who hate the Jews. Everyone hates the Jews. We're just part of the whole world that hates the Jews. This is the message of the PA to its people. Now, fundamental to this is that it's continuing until today. And here's an article from not so long ago. The danger of this Israeli Jewish system reaches all parts of the world. The Jews are continuing to fulfill the same negative social, economic, and political role that caused European society to vomit them out. The Jews were vomited out as an act of self-defense. This is the message. And continuing to do it today. And now, of course, who's suffering? The Palestinians are suffering, but all of the world is threatened by them. Therefore, if you fight and you kill a Jew, and I'm not going to go into all the sources of this, but if you're fighting and killing a Jew, you're actually doing not only a service to Palestinians, but you're actually doing a service to all humanity. That's the message of the PA to its people. We have to defend humanity. The Jews are here. We have to fight them. Now, has this message been affected by the Palestinian Authority? And here is one poll. It was a number of years ago. I'm sure it's even worse today. Palestinians were asked, people hate the Jews because of the way Jews behave. This was the ADL poll. People hate Jews because of the way Jews behave. Look at the result. 87% of Palestinians say it's true. 87%. An entire population believes that Jews have no right to exist. We have no history in the land. We're here only because we were hated. This is a fundamental, and therefore they feel justified in fighting us. They feel justified in killing us, and everything boils down to coming from this. So, summary of Palestinian Authority anti-Semitism, how important it is for them. Jews have no history in the land. Jews are evil, endangered not only Palestinians, but all of humanity. Therefore, the Jews brought hatred and anti-Semitism upon themselves. Europeans finally wanted to solve their Jewish problem after centuries of killing Jews and massacres and the Holocaust. They decided to solve their Jewish problem by stealing Palestine and sending the Jews here. Therefore, Israel is a colonial impact with no right to exist. And finally, the Jewish evil continues to threaten humanity today. I'll just make one postscript. I haven't even touched on its religious anti-Semitism, which is also fundamental. All of these messages appear in the religious anti-Semitism, but with God's approval, with Allah's approval. Jews are enemies of Allah, monkeys of pigs, etc., so that you put all of this together and you have one horrific, powerful message. It's not just isolated hate speech. This is fundamental to Palestinian ideology. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Itamar. I'm sure there's, tons of questions that I could follow up with on that, and we will try to get to some in a moment. Turning to Asaf. Asaf, if Palestinian youth are being taught in a variety of ways that Jews are the enemy of Allah and terrorism is martyrdom, what hope is there for the future of peace and reconciliation? We know that Fatah summer camp slogans learned by 6- and 7-year-olds include "We will die and Palestine will live." Do you think that the West has turned a blind eye to this incitement and outright child abuse? And if so, why and what can we do?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Rebecca and Kim, for having me. And obviously, it's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues, Itamar and Marcus. Always a pleasure to tackle these issues. Just to put into context, I mean, my subspecialty has been UNRWA for the past 3 decades. I wrote a book about UNRWA, and I've dealt with the whole issue of these problems. And so I have no disagreement with anything Marcus and Itamar said. I think they add to amplify the larger issue we're tackling. I think that to your question, I mean, I think that Faulkner's quote, as far as the past is never dead, it's never really the past, is actually true when it comes to Palestinians. They live and breathe that every day. What you've seen here over the past, through decades, is the fact that UNRWA has become the gatekeeper of the one single issue that maintains Palestinian identity and is synonymous to the entire national identity. That is, the Palestinian refuginess, is Palestinianism. And so the entire ideology is based on maintaining this stasis. The existence of the PA, the existence of so-called Palestinian refugees, is a reminder to the world that they are the victims of the world itself. So how that, so the imagery is really critical here, and that feeds in, of course, to Itamar's presentation at large. What we've seen over the past decades of support is that, for example, the United States, which has been the third largest contributor as far as Western monies to UNRWA itself, they've maintained in the stasis. It's been, until the Trump administration came about, the U.S. has supported close to $400 million a year in support of UNRWA. And the primary function of UNRWA has been, and the main product has been, education. And so they have hijacked the entire teachers' unions. They have hired, superintendents have been involved in Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and whatnot. And those institutions have been hijacked, not only educationally wise, but also physically. I mean, those have been actually used as fertile ground to launch attacks. They've been used actually for tunneling munitions and back and forth. I mean, and so when you look at the architecture of how all this is played out, when Israel is accused of attacking schools and whatnot, there's a clear architecture that's played out here in order to maintain this infrastructure at large. Going back to how UNRWA has used this, I would say that since the 1960s, there has been a clear understanding that if the PLO came to the understanding that they can't defeat Israel militarily, they can defeat Israel through what we call in the social sciences the use of soft power. So hijacking the academy, hijacking the media. This has been a consistent messaging that has come out of the PLO at large. And UNRWA has been that vehicle to make that happen. The consistent congressional investigations into UNRWA funding, into the anti-Semitism, into everything that we all agree upon that is taking place here has been looked at as far as looking at the textbooks. The problem is that there's been no baseline for any of this, and so all of the investigations of who is looking at any of this, who is entitled to look at all of this all together, and so there's been a lot of refusal to take into any kind of transparency and accountability. Marcus, Itamar, and I have all been in this rodeo for a long time. There have been different proposals in congressional committees to have Itamar's outfit look and translate the textbooks, people from memory, other institutions to look and try to put it out there so people can see what is actually happening. What you're referring to and what is correct in the sense of this is child abuse and looking at that, they don't see it that way. This all relates to the consistent ideology of the victimology and the blame of how the architecture is played out all goes back into Nakba ideology. That is the fact that the satanic creation of Israel in 1948, we have to remind the world of why, that was the cardinal sin. And the consistent reminder is the so-called perpetual existence of Arab Palestinian refugees from generation to generation. And the vehicle to make that happen in that consistent messaging is through the education. And that education is consistent. It is unchanging. It is anti-Semitic. And it is Islamist. It goes from generation to generation. You could look at examples of those who've tried to even, and I know we've as far as our limited time, people have tried to teach about Jewish history. So one example, of course, is our colleague Muhammad Dajani, who was, of course, lost his job because he took a delegation of Palestinian teachers to Auschwitz to talk about the Holocaust. The only Holocaust is the Nakba, 1948. Anybody who denies anything like that is, of course, seen as a denier of Palestinian identity. That does not go hand in hand with the narrative. And so the messaging has been consistent from generation to generation. Today, it's even worse. And I agree with, both Itamar and Marcus's assessment. I think what we have today is it's been amplified for the use of social media, through the use of other outlets. And so the vociferousness and the volume of all of this is coming in. They may not be buying hook, line, and sinker, remembering who Yasser Arafat was or Oslo or whatnot. I mean, I remember during the Oslo years being involved in those years. The number one issue was to talk about peace education, changing the textbook, changing the narrative. We've been talking about this for over 30 years. They have constantly refused to do so. So when American policymakers and Western policymakers at large look at the symptomatic issues that are playing out here, they don't see, unfortunately, the textbooks for them are the symptom. What they look is the fact that how is it possible that we are stateless after all these years, that we're so-called refugees after 75 plus years, and so they validate that. And so there has not been a consistent mechanism to crack down on this. We have demanded this. We have asked this in congressional meetings over the years. Again, up until Trump came to office, when Nikki Haley, basically cut down the funding, that was a significant event that took place. But of course, under the Biden administration, the money has now been resumed, and the ideology and the hatred hasn't stopped from generation to generation. So there is they use and they understand, and the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA, by extension, has consistently agreed that that children are legitimate vehicles to pass on the messaging. But it's part of the fact that they are refugees. It's part of the fact that Israel exists. And so the infrastructure is circular, and the fact that it goes back to Israel's mere existence validates the entire narrative. And so part of what we need to be doing, and this is for years part of the challenge, is, of course, I would go further. I say, what we're seeing here is also a violation, even on American law, when it comes to terrorism. I mean, this violates the fact that we're talking about, in the 1960s, American policymakers came out with what is known as Section 301C when it comes to foreign aid, when it comes to entities that teach and indoctrinate towards terrorism. You have that perfect example with UNRWA and with the PLO at large, but in particular with UNRWA textbooks. And when these issues are being called out by all of us here, and anybody who cares about the so-called perpetual existence of Arab Palestinian refugees, is that they are flatly denied because they're able to represent the symbolism of the fact that we are refugees because of Western powers, because of denial of Israel for our existence. And so we have to remind the world that this is our infrastructure. And so it all feeds into this larger issue. But I think, and I agree 100%, child abuse is taking place here. The world needs to understand that. I mean, it was UNRWA, spokespeople, namely individuals like Chris Gunness in his day, who would take fake bloody babies, literally go on TV and say, this is the byproduct of the Israeli occupation. So, no matter, the imagery that, obviously we know plays larger than words, they're able to turn it on us. And so when we look at the factual issues, again, unfortunately, facts don't matter when you're trying to explain the emotional narrative that they're able to put out there by selling, as Itamar detailed in his reports, and Marcus has been doing with his work, as far as what the facts are. And that's what we need to break down. My point is, and I think that this is the critical issue, so long as, to my mind, that the current existence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is rooted in the existence of the so-called Arab Palestinian refugees. So long as they continue to exist from generation to generation, and it's the only population of refugees worldwide that continues to grow, and there's a whole other lecture about how they do that, but it is the only population that you can inherit Palestinian refugees at large, and how it grows from generation. You're talking about millions of individuals who believe in this ideology, hook, line, and sinker. And for this to stop, we got to start. This is why the right of return, UNRWA, and everything that UNRWA produces needs to be cut off, and that can start a beginning of a transition. Until that happens, this is why the cycle will continue from generation to generation.
Well said, Asaf. Thank you. There's many comments. One that came to mind is, do you think that in the international arena, the fact that the Palestinians have for decades just outright lied, and that they work in a sort of bad faith capacity, I mean, is that something that you think diplomats around the world recognize? Or do you think that, that most buy into the story and understand that, they're still stateless and it's Israel's fault?
I mean, look, I live and breathe in the academy. So, I mean, if you're talking about the environment today that you're seeing today, under the trigger word, or what we know today as intersectionality and the root cause of all oppressed groups, there is nobody more oppressed than the Palestinians. They are the gold standard of oppression. And so everybody who believes in groups and minority groups somehow has to support the Palestinian narrative. I think that over the years, we've seen people call a spade a spade. And by the way, this has not been a partisan issue. It's been a bipartisan issue over the years. One of the first people to call this out on this was the late Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor in the House, and was able to call Kofi Annan out and say, how is it possible that I'm a Holocaust survivor, and talking about the fallacious historical narrative that the Palestinians present. So there has been a consistent kind of trying to expose this. However, the success story of the Palestinians is rooted in their imagery. I mean, they're able to manufacture child martyrology, they're able to factor facts, and all of this has been consistent part of the infrastructure. And I think that the challenge is to expose that without without seemingly, without coming off as saying we want to destroy you. I mean, the idea of how Palestinian identity goes hand in hand and moving along a peace process, or how to deal with that. The imagery has been that, of course, victimizer, and the satanic alliance that plays out that Israel is a vehicle of the United States and we're out to destroy you. And so everybody in the human rights world and the peace and the conflict and peace kind of studies is all jumping down our throats that we are out to destroy and kill Palestinians. UNRWA, let me be clear, and the textbooks at large are basically maintaining them in their stasis. It is preventing any kind of social mobility. It's preventing it from moving along to any movement at large. But the idea of the use of soft power and anti-Semitism, Mahmoud Abbas himself is the perfect example of that. I mean, his entire dissertation, which is an anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist document, is still a downloaded PDF document on the PA's website. And he is a byproduct of the Soviet institutions, which is exactly what the Soviets did in the 50s in the United States. And it's exactly what what Palestinians have done in American Academy since the 1960s, sponsored by Arab money, and with the creation of this consistent narrative from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm. I add something.
If I could just weigh in on that for a moment, and always fascinating to listen to Asaf, such an expert on UNRWA and so many subjects as well. But I would argue that, in answer to your question, Rebecca, that no, I do not think that serious policymakers are fools, and I think the textbooks are the key to this. The textbooks are, if you like, the largest corpus of Palestinian national identity that one will find. There are 230 odd books, and they are written down. They are in black and white, and they're shocking. They shock a liberal parliament sitting in Brussels to the extent that year after year they condemn the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA for teaching hate, for anti-Semitism, for creating an atmosphere where young people are convinced to martyr themselves for creating an atmosphere of jihad. This shocks these liberal European policymakers because they're decent people. Because, as they say time and time again, when we talk to them, I would absolutely hate the idea that my children are being taught this, that my children are being told that death is more important than life, which is a direct quote from the Palestinian curriculum. So no, I do not accept that the idea that the Palestinians and UNRWA can get away with teaching this appalling curriculum school day after school day is acceptable to reasonable people. Not in the European Parliament, not in Westminster, not in the Australian Parliament, not in parliaments around the world.
That's very encouraging. Itamar, yes.
Your question was, do they accept the lies? Do the Europeans accept the lies? And I want to differentiate between a couple of things there. So for years, I've been showing members of parliament and governments the Palestinian Authority historical lies. And for a very long time, what they would respond is, okay, they're trying to create a narrative, they're trying to create a history. It doesn't really matter so much, that's the past. Today, what matters is there's an occupation, and you get rid of the occupation, and that's what's important right now. So that was the general message. By the way, I would say primarily of government, that is State Department and foreign affairs members, the professional people in foreign policy. Members of parliament were more horrified, but for the most part, they said, okay, let's deal with the issues that are today. Let's not worry about history. One of the things that I'm finding important now is, and that was basically what I did in my presentation, and that's why I did it. I want the world to understand that the denial of history is the fundamental reason that they're telling their people that Israel has no right to exist, and then connected to the anti-Semitism. 3 weeks ago, I was speaking at a hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Congress on specifically this topic of anti-Semitism, and I presented this to the members of Congress. And I spoke afterwards, both during the hearing and afterwards, to both Democrats and Republicans, and we're going to be doing follow up on this, because they understand that you can't, especially when it's all a whole ideology, you can't just say, okay, this part's okay, this part's not okay, don't be a terrorist. No, you don't start being a terrorist. You start with all the hatred, you start with all the denial. Israel doesn't have a right to exist. The whole world hates the Jews, not just us. So that's what I'm trying to make them understand. It's actually a total ideology, and it must be fought. And we're planning follow-ups in the Foreign Affairs Committee of Congress. But I recently presented this also in the European Parliament and numerous other parliaments in Europe. And the message is getting through, and we're planning follow-ups in all of these places. And it's critical because the members of parliament get it very quickly. The professionals in the foreign ministries take a lot more pressure. But if we get enough pressure from the parliaments, I think eventually we'll be able to force the foreign ministries to change government policies as well.
That's very helpful to know, because in the world of advocacy and those of us that are not necessarily scholars in the field, to know that this cannot go on forever, that at some point, the reality has to play in here a little bit, and people have to understand that we're fighting actual propaganda and lies for decades, and it's very difficult to really think about a formidable peace when that is the partner. I know that we've said in Hebrew for a very long time that there's no partner, and so that really is what it comes down to.
Where did also, if I can, Rebecca, one more. What I'm trying to have the governments in the world, and the Israeli government, also understand is that we expose the Palestinian Authority to pay salaries to terrorists, so we originally did school book work, others are doing it now. There are the inciting children to be martyrs. What I want them all to understand is these are not problems. These are symptoms. There is one fundamental Palestinian Authority worldview of hate, denial of Israel's rights, and that expresses itself in the school books, in the denial, in the paying salaries, terrorists everywhere. Those are symptoms of a fundamental problem that we see going through Palestinian society.
For sure. Let's talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords. I'll start with you, Marcus. How do the Abraham Accords play into the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? The Arab world seems to be largely focused on other things. The Abraham Accords moving full steam ahead. Having been accustomed to having the ear of the Arab world for decades, Are Palestinian leaders tone deaf to the changes taking place around them?
Well, I think it's clear that the Palestinian Authority is absolutely going against the current of the Sunni world. And I am not just talking about those Abraham Accords countries, but I'm talking about a much wider and actually much more interesting field than just those countries, as important as they are. They're being left behind. They're being left behind specifically in the textbook issue in which we are involved, but they're being left behind in so many other elements as well. We spend a lot of time talking to just wonderful interlocutors in the Arab world. And, I can say in private conversation, there is, without a shadow of a doubt, a level of frustration with the Palestinian Authority for the absolute immobility of their positions and everything you've heard from us over the last half an hour. So, we made it very clear that it's the Palestinian national strategy to maintain this ribat, as one might say in Arabic, this low-level guerrilla warfare, if you like. But when you look at that world, there are absolutely fantastic things happening. And Rebecca, if I can, I would just like to, go through some of that, because, if we are looking at anti-Semitism in, outside of the Palestinian Authority, it is being tackled within education. We entered into a joint venture with the United Arab Emirates before the Abraham Accords, as it happens, and it's been a privilege. We're working there with true professionals, and it's resulted in our benchmarks becoming the basis for Emirati textbooks. We wrote the Holocaust education material for their textbooks. It's a first for the Arab world, and we're not just interested in how Jews died in the Shoah. We're interested in how they lived in the Arabian Peninsula for millennia. This work with the UAE is a real roadmap for what is possible. Bahrain has set up a national task force based on our work to reform the curriculum. Again, wonderful people to work with. And their curriculum is being entirely rewritten as we speak. A 4-year process. We've been part of eliminating the huge amounts of anti-Semitism from the school curricula of Saudi Arabia. Isn't this just fantastic? This was the most complicated of our revisions. It affects 6 million children. The Saudi Arabian curriculum was extraordinarily anti-Semitic, endless teaching of Jews being pigs and liars and cheats and donkeys, and it's gone. This material has now been taken out, and we met with Prince al-Bandar recently, went through the report, and we could turn around to him and say, this is remarkable 4-year work that has been completed, and there is more work yet to do. Even the Qataris are in our, and we all know, what bad actors, they have been in certain elements, but they are in our orbit. And while problematic material remains, we estimate now that something like 60% of the anti-Semitism has been removed. Morocco, with whom we work, has wonderful content about Jews in textbooks, teaching about Shabbat, Mimuna, and that Jews are an essential part of Moroccan society. The Egyptians, with whom we work, they've rolled out a year-by-year reform. So they're now at grade 5. Everything up to grade 5 is devoid of anti-Semitism entirely, although traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes are in the higher grades and work needs to be done. And finally, Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, Sunni Muslim country, has a school curriculum devoid of anti-Semitism. So this is a huge vector of anti-Semitism in school education in the Muslim world. 300 million children studying in those schools today. And imagine a world without anti-Semitism in those textbooks, which is what we are working on. We have a lot to do. We have the credibility, tools, methodology to do that. And it is happening. So also imagine a world when the Palestinians are so isolated in teaching hate, teaching anti-Semitism, jihad, martyrdom, day after day. Increasingly, they will become outliers in the Sunni Muslim world in which they reside.
Not true. Asaf, do you have a comment on that?
No, I mean, look, I think that everything that's being done is critical, and the reality shows the disconnect between what's happening in the academy and what's actually happening in the region itself. I mean, I think that the unfortunate reality is that the Abraham Accords have not met have not made the kind of dent we wanted to see in the American Academy and Western Academy. I mean, the lens in which the conflict is being taught and is being taught for years and years is through the only lens of BDS. And so the centrality of Palestinian identity and Palestinian statelessness and refuginess and everything that goes with this is still the gold standard of teaching. And it is removed and detached from reality on the ground. In my other hat, which I am the current head of the Association of Middle East Studies in Africa, this is exactly what we're working on, to create those kind of collaborations, working on research and inquisitive research between our friends and colleagues with Bahrain and the Saudis and other people in the Gulf in order to show what's happening. The problem is that the American Academy, as a test case at large, still believe that the centrality of the Middle East resides within the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, or lack thereof. All roads need to go through Ramallah, which is exactly what the Abraham Accords showed does not need to happen. And they consistently continue to remind that. And so the gap that exists that we're dealing with is actually to expose all of that. I mean, I was recently giving talks and briefings in Portugal, and about these very issues about the Abraham Accords and whatnot. And of course, at a university, and of course, the consistent question, notwithstanding what I said, was, what about the Palestinians? And what about the poor refugees? I mean, so the symptoms that, that we are talking about, and I agree that the bigger issue, that these are indeed symptoms of a larger problem. And when you're talking about foreign policymakers, you're talking about funding, this has to be looked at, as a total funding issue as far as where the money is going and what you're funding with this. And we are, and the fact that if you're going to crack down on terrorism and jihadism and martyrology, you got to cut the head, at the top. And so, these symptoms are indeed perpetuating the problem. We got to deal with the larger problem at large to cut that down. And within the academy at large, all these monies are still coming in to fund these kind of pro-Palestinian teachings that are consistently, disconnected from reality, which Marcus is talking about. And we also have to deal with that as well.
Right. For our final question, Marcus, I'm thinking about the future. I'm trying to be a little positive. I do believe education is really the key to solving most things. And I am hopeful that future generations of Palestinian youth will change their ideas when they're not, under the abuse and brainwashing that they're currently under. So thinking about the future, obviously sometimes it takes a few generations to really make a shift. How hopeful are you? And also, what do you expect, or what is your prediction when Mahmoud Abbas leaves office, whether from illness or what?
Really, really important questions, Rebecca. And to paraphrase the Hebrew, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of one. And I don't think anybody really has a decent answer for you for that, which is positive. We see, first of all, there is no serious organization around Abbas. He is hopelessly corrupt. The regime which is established in Abu Qatar is hopelessly corrupt. There is certainly not a structure which any of us are aware of, which speaks to the possibility of a future leadership when he goes. Remember that his father lived to, I think, 103. So I wouldn't put money on this happening anytime soon. But when it does happen, I think we can expect, unfortunately, chaos. And I would love to sit here and tell you there will be an enlightened leadership in the Palestinian Authority when this happens. What one is fearful of is Hamas taking over the West Bank as it has Gaza. One is fearful of Iran's influence, which is getting stronger and stronger within the Palestinian Authority, the areas that the Palestinian Authority control, rather than Hamas. That will become greater and greater. These are not good outcomes. I am sharing with you. I cannot point to a Palestinian leader who is a serious contender who is committed in a way that we would like that person to be committed to, the possibility of Israelis and Palestinians being able to forge peace. I can tell you one thing though, and Rebecca, you talked about generational change. What we have seen and what we see in education time and time again is that the school generation is something like 6 to 7 years. You can get change that quickly in society as textbooks change, for bad. One of the first things that the Nazis did when they gained power was change the textbooks. And hey, presto, in 1939, you had a German youth who were absolutely ready to do the most appalling, horrific things to the Jewish citizens of their country and the countries around them. And the reverse applies. The UAE curriculum wasn't always a good curriculum, but when Mohammed Ben Zayed made the decision in the mid 2015, 2016 to make those changes. I think anyone who's spent any time in the UAE, and especially anybody who is visibly Jewish, can attest to an atmosphere of tolerance, which they will find in that country. Textbooks can allow for change extremely quickly. Ideas like respect for the other, for the individual other, peacemaking is a way to resolve conflict. When there is no hate, when there is an idea of peaceful coming together of disparate elements of society, which is what you are having in the UAE outside of anything to do with Jews. Other ethnic groups within the UAE who are treated so well in the textbooks. This makes a big difference within the country itself. So I think if and when there was in any scenario that one can conceive of, a miraculous change in the Palestinian Authority and an idea of peacemaking, of tolerance, of forging ahead, of acceptance of Jews in Israel, and the textbooks are changed, I think you can see change within society within a few years. Do I think this? Do I see any horizon that this can happen at the moment? I wish I could tell you yes, Rebecca, but unfortunately I cannot.
Well, it's been a great conversation today. I think we could go on for a couple more hours with the three of you, but we do have to close. Marcus, Asaf, Itamar, it's been a real pleasure to have your expertise today. Thank you for joining CAM's webinar on this very important subject. And thank you for all that you do in the fight against anti-Semitism. We don't take it for granted.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you so much.